Boom. There we go. Perfect. So the second thing I was going to mention that is as we go through the presentations today, please remain muted unless you have a question you would like to ask, and we will get to those during the Q&A portion at the end of the session. But as we're going through, anytime that you have a question, you can pop that into the chat, and Mike and I will try to keep track of those as we go. So that would be very helpful. Today's Lunch and Learn does offer 1 hour AIA and APA continuing education credits. So if you would like to utilize those credits, please just type your name and your AIA or APA number into the chat, and we will keep track of that for you. And if you would like a different credential, if you would like to show that you were an attendee at this session for a different credentialing, please just include that in the chat as well, and we will make sure that we get you that certification. A special thank you to our Lunch and Learn sponsor today, the Graciano Corporation. The generous support of our sponsors allows us to continue providing free educational programs like this, and it helps to support our work and our mission. So we will talk more about this as we go through the session. We'll learn a little bit more about who the Florida Trust is and what we do. But in a nutshell, we are Florida's statewide nonprofit that works to protect the history and heritage of the state of Florida. I would like to take just a minute to talk about who our speakers are. You guys have already met me, but Mike Costin is past president of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, and he will tell you a little more about himself as we get into the session today. And again, a huge thank you to our sponsor, the Graciano Corporation. So with that, I would love to get started with our presentation. Mike, do you want to take it from here?
Absolutely. So I'm so glad that everyone is here. This is a really great turnout. I'm glad to see everyone sharing where they're from, and really we're representing the state very well, from Key West to Jacksonville to Tallahassee, and even outside the state. So welcome everyone. Um, as Melissa said, my name is Mike Cosden. I'm the immediate past president of the Board of Trustees for the Florida Trust. And if you're not familiar with the organization, as Melissa alluded to, we're the nonprofit organization that is dedicated to promoting preservation and inclusive sharing of the diverse architectural, historical, and archaeological heritage of Florida. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that throughout the presentation, and how we're trying to stay on top of the future of preservation. One thing I wanted to mention before we go on with the presentation, I just wanted to ask, was anyone here at the Preservation on Main Street conference over the summer? You can just throw it in the chat or raise your hand. I see Jeffrey's hand go up. All right. I see a few people. That's great. I asked because Melissa and I were fortunate enough to give this presentation at POMS, Preservation on Main Street. Rick was there. Yep. But we had so much engagement. This is a very good problem to have. We had so much engagement and interaction that we could not get through the entire presentation. So we decided it would be a great topic for a lunch and learn. And now we can also share some of the feedback and engagement that we had at that initial presentation in this one with you. So this is almost like a new and improved version of that presentation. So thank you if you're seeing it for the second time and actually going to get to complete it, or thank you if you're here for the first time. So I'll tell you a little bit about our agenda for today, the things that we're going to talk about. We're going to be thinking about how we got to this point, engaging broadly, looking at community-led efforts, the evolution of preservation, and finally, thinking about some tools to get to where we need to be. But what you really wanted to know is a little bit about you all. So we'd love, I know a lot of you have shared your name already. If you want to share what you think the biggest challenge you face in preservation is in the chat, we will come back to this information. And I know Melissa has a question that she always loves to ask at the beginning of these, so I'm going to tee her up for that question. And it is, raise your hand or type it in the chat if you think you are a preservationist. I'll raise my hand.
Thank
All
you.
right, I see some hands going up. Yep.
It's feeling good.
I don't see any hands down.
Joe, I'm glad to hear
Okay.
that you think you're a preservationist. That makes me happy. We do have board members who were on the board before they realized that they were in fact preservationists, but that was a while ago.
I'll turn it back over to you, Melissa, to think about some issues that we've heard.
Great, thank you. So, as we were doing this work the first time around, and then this time around as well, we really did want to hear from our stakeholders around the state, to hear from them what were some of the biggest issues that were facing them in the historic preservation field. And the first thing that I would say to that is, as we take a step back, we have to realize that the idea of historic preservation, when we were in person, I asked another favorite question that I ask is for people to define what they think historic preservation is. And so as I've been asking that question over the years, it has kind of been growing. I think that historic preservation is a field that is becoming more inclusive of a lot of different things and telling a lot of different stories in ways that it maybe wasn't 20 years ago. So as our definitions change and our movement broadens, I think so do some of the challenges that we face. So thank you so much for putting some of the challenges that y'all face in the chat. These are great. This is very helpful. And we'll circle back to these. Yeah, sea level rise, face of development pressure. Absolutely. These are all great. Here are a few other things that we've heard, and then you guys can tell me if these you can empathize with these if these sound like something that you're working with well as well. Amending historic preservation ordinances to better recognize local priorities and be more inclusive of cultural significance. Um, yeah, our definition of historic preservation is who preservationists are needs to include those who are working on historic preservation commissions and the staff that are working on these commissions and the regulatory work of creating preservation ordinances and implementing those ordinances is a big part of the work that we're doing and can also be a challenge. Zoning overlays in historic preservation character areas, um, maybe limiting things like the scale of infill to protect cultural heritage. These are all real things that a lot of our communities are facing right now. Um, we trying to keep up with everyone joining the chat too, or joining the conversation. So thank you for being patient with me. So updating design guidelines to be more user-friendly to lay people and property owners and flexing design guidelines to adopt flood mitigation practices. That ties into some of the things we're seeing in the chat right now as well. So that's probably an overarching issue. Looking beyond the National Register of Historic Places for ways to celebrate local heritage, the issue of significance is something obviously that we're hearing a lot about and thinking a lot about as preservationists right now. And this one is one that we're particularly thinking about in some of our communities here in Florida, but resolving the heirs property issue to keep vulnerable longtime families from losing their properties and preserving blocks of historic housing to keep generational wealth in communities, maybe to make within-trification happen as opposed to gentrification. And I think Mike will talk about that a little later. So these are some of the issues I think that we are looking at as a movement in Florida and in your communities probably, and then also nationally. So these are some of the emerging trends that we're facing. Mike, is there anything that you would add to that?
No, just that we've got some really great responses in the chat. People have put a lot of thought into these answers, and I think they
Yeah.
tie into some of the themes you talked about, but also pressures from development,
Hmm.
pressures from misconceptions about historic preservation and the cost of preservation and maintaining historic structures, and then
Mm.
the lack of a state historic tax credit, which we can certainly touch on, but a lot of things that tie into what you mentioned here.
Yeah, absolutely. Anthony posted the false notion that historic preservation is an impediment to sustainable development. I think that's huge. Economic benefits is huge as well. Harry, one thing that we're working on is trying to get the economic impact of preservation in Florida, that document, that data that we all really rely on to do our jobs and to advocate. We need to get that updated. So we know that's something that's on our plate that we're trying to look forward to in the years ahead for sure. Um, yeah, this is great. Thanks, guys. So just a real quick, I guess maybe micro step, not back, but just getting some context of where we are is thinking about where we've been. And I think that historic preservation has evolved as a driver of community and economic vitality. I think maybe back in 1966, when the National Preservation Act was passed, perhaps there was more of a focus just on maybe individual buildings. And now we're thinking more about historic preservation as part of community building. So we've already talked a little bit about what our definition of historic preservation is. And if you feel motivated, I always would love for people to put it in the chat. I've been doing this question for years, and I don't think I've heard the same answer yet twice. Maybe I'll do an academic study someday on what historic preservation means, and you guys could be a part of that. But from an economic standpoint, I think what we are trying to build on is this notion that historic preservation creates jobs, that heritage tourism drives funds and drives economies. And the federal historic tax credit has generated more than $200 million. But imagine if we also had a state historic credit to match that. So those are things where we've been and where we hope to keep building on that. Mike, were you going to do this one or was I?
I'll talk about this.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
this is immediately ties into what Melissa said. Recognizing the importance of what historic preservation is doing for our state. It's a driver, obviously, for jobs, for various industries, from tourism to the people that are doing the work of the historic preservation trades, to developers that are finding ways to reuse historic structures. Huge impact on property values, and this is always something that we need to share. Historic districts, people that buy homes in them, one of the reasons they do that is they know it's going to have a pretty stable property value, and it's integral to why they do it. Heritage tourism, as I mentioned, we know that heritage tourism is a huge driver in Florida. It's one of the reasons people choose their destinations here. And I work at a heritage tourism site. I'll mention it right here. My day job, I work at the Edison and Ford Winter Estates here in Fort Myers, Florida. So I know it's a really important piece of our state economy. Revitalization in main streets, creating places that feel unique and bespoke and are really part of the communities that they represent and are not just a carbon copy of what you might see anywhere. All of those things connect people and create corridors that are important to our state. Environmental impacts. And I think this is something that Melissa touched on and some of the people in the chat as well. Historic preservation and environmental movements and sort of everyday sustainability efforts when it comes to flood proofing and things like that. There's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram. So that's something we're thinking more and more about. And then arts and cultural impacts. There is often a tie-in. I'm getting a thumbs up from Amy. Thank you. There's often a tie-in between historic preservation. Many of you probably have a building that's historic to your community, was important, and has been repurposed as an art center, performing space, cultural space where there's concerts or arts, things like that. And Amy, I see you raising your hand. Or maybe you're just thumbs upping. But if you have a question you'd like to ask, definitely put it in that chat and we will address it. That's great. I'll mention too, Melissa touched on the concept of withintrification. And if you have not heard this concept before, I think it's really important to thinking about how the historic preservation movement goes forward. The concept is that the the people who are involved in the process of preserving a space, whether it's a building or a whole neighborhood, are stakeholders, and that they're going to be the people that are impacted are going to have a seat at the table. They're going to be leading the process. So rather than gentrification, which is often an outside-led process that's led by developers, investors, this would be a process of community members leading that and having a say in how that preservation is going to impact their community. And this is something we see happening more often. Our current board president, Ennis Davis, noted that the Deuces is one good example of that. You can see that you've got people organizing in a community toward the same goals. They're having a say in how the district's image is promoted, and also physical buildings, how they're improved. And I think economic revitalization is a key part of that as well. So as we talk about the future of historic preservation today, I think this community-led preservation or withintrification is an important piece of it to consider. So when we think about where we're going, I wanted to mention a few broad trends that Melissa and I have discussed here. One is international collaboration. We see this happening more and more. There's kind of a broad definition of heritage preservation internationally. In fact, maybe more internationally than there is in the United States, thinking about things like cultural significance as a part of why it's important to preserve a place. I wanted to mention, a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with UNESCO World Heritage Sites. If you don't look at your screen, maybe, What do you think is the only UNESCO World Heritage Site in the state of Florida? Any guesses? You can throw it in the chat if you know. I see it. Oh, Formosa, that's a great guess. Everglades, that's it. We shouldn't have put the photo there, Melissa. I think we made a mistake. We
I
should
feel
have
like we
we
could
should
have
have had a
put
picture.
like a different photo just to fool people. We could have done like the University of Tampa or something.
There you go. Yeah, not that there couldn't be many other World Heritage Site worthy places in Florida. Yes, but the Everglades is the only one. I have to throw that out there. Yep. We even have a master's thesis that someone wrote about it. Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. So that's a broad trend that we see. We also see national affinity groups that grow across borders. Things like Latinos in heritage conservation are a good example of that, or Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in historic preservation. So that's a trend that we see that has a positive impact. And I think another one that people probably think of when you immediately think about what's the future of historic preservation is the digital impact there, digital connectivity. You can have things like historic sites that are related to cultural backgrounds that haven't really been explored previously. That digital connectivity of the internet is going to be able to help people to do that. And then you've got international laws that can have a major impact, like the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. Those things can create norms that could have a huge impact on how regulations are enforced and prevent destructions of heritage sites around the world.
All right. So, one of the key trends that I see that is taking us kind of into this increasingly broad definition of historic preservation that I talked about before is utilizing the way that we build collaborations. So, focusing on that, on whether what other organizations there are that are working to do some of the same work that we do, or that we could do better by partnering with them. I know for us at the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, this is timely today because, as I mentioned, the Historical Commission is just wrapped up their grant hearing for the next fiscal year today. So for us, one of our big things that we do from an advocacy perspective is we advocate for the full funding of those historic preservation grants every year. So we do that, and I think that we do a good job of that, and we are very proud of the work that we do for that. But what we discovered a few years ago is that we can do that better if we work with other organizations, maybe our sister partner organizations with us, and maybe have some overlapping audience, but some individual audiences different than us. So we're getting more people to kind of say the same talking point to the legislature, and that is helpful for us. So we created the Florida Coalition of Historic Places. So we have a lot of different preservation and planning and historic organizations that are kind of coming together under that broad umbrella. And then when we go talk with lawmakers, we have our one pager that has all of our partner logos down there. We have Thousand Friends of Florida. We have the Historical Commission. We have FPAN. We have a lot of other really great, the Florida Historical Society, a lot of really great, strong nonprofits that are coming together to tell this story, all asking for the legislature to fund brick and mortar preservation throughout the state of Florida. And I think that is happening in a lot of different ways across the state. And to Mike's point, we're also partnering nationally. We do a lot of work with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, really just trying to engage broadly across the spectrum. And then last year, we did a partnership with Florida Parks to help advocate for keeping our parks wild, I guess is one way to say it, but preserving our natural spaces as well. Jeffrey, I saw your thumbs up on that, because that's part of what I think our broad definition of preservation can include too, is our shared historic spaces outside our landscapes. Something that when the Florida Trust talks to people about historic preservation, I did a lecture here at the Florida Trust for Florida State University yesterday, their historic preservation class. Next month, I'll be talking to the University of Florida. A big thing, because I think students and our future generation of preservationists are another audience that we want to engage broadly with. But an important thing that I say is that we want to work so that everyone can see themselves in historic preservation and the places that we work to preserve. And so our mission is that people see our historic places, they're aware that they exist, then they experience something there with them. They have an experience for themselves that they uncover and explore with a historic resource. And then because they saw it, because they experienced, they are part of preserving it. They're a part of preservation. So we're trying to get this broad audience and we're trying to kind of really work on activating it. And of course, working on our representation of the stories that we tell throughout that process. So we are aware that we need a broad coalition to be relevant, but are we allowing all into the movement? I would love to know your thoughts on that. I'll stop talking for a second so I can look at the chat. Yeah, very cool. Thank you. I see some questions here that we'll answer when we get to our Q&A question. But I guess my question for you right now is, do we think that we've allowed everyone, or do you have examples of some folks that you have worked with for your preservation in your communities that are a little bit maybe outside of the box that you'd like to share with folks? Some folks that we've worked with that we mentioned is NAPC, Preservation Action, our national grassroots advocacy preservation organization. That's another great one that we can work with. Internally, we've broken the state of Florida down into regions. And so now everyone in Florida has a regional council that we can kind of activate for local preservation. Um, Anything else that we want to mention real quick while we're talking about our broad engagement here? This was, while you're thinking about it, this was something that I found interesting when I first started working really closely with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. People who served on historical commissions did not think that they were preservationists. And I think that's a little bit of a disconnect and an opportunity there, because I feel like the people who are doing the regulatory work at the local level should probably think of themselves as preservationists. So I try to work on empowering them to do that. Um, awesome. So I just wanted to take a brief moment and talk a little bit more about what we mean when we say we want to do more to represent our full communities. Historic preservation practices and ideas are being applied, like I said, to an increasingly wide variety of places, including sacred places, historic and cultural landscape, landmarks, ephemeral places, what kinds of sites people are trying to preserve, and being responsible to what people care about. So kind of bottom up sort of preservation instead of kind of top down. And that's a lot of what I think our 11 to Save program is really good at. We're hearing what people in their communities think is important and then shining the light on that instead of us going into their communities and telling them what's important. I think that's a big, important distinction. Another example that I really love is from Ybor City, Sarah McNamara, who's a history professor now at Texas A&M, but she's written a wonderful book about Ybor City and Latinas and the work that they did against fascism. But these stories can engage and protect historic places, and they can tell so many different stories. I think that for many, Ybor City didn't always have the women's experience and the women's advocacy voice that came from it. And Sarah's book and her work and this beautiful mural that actually won a preservation award is part of changing that narrative and flipping the script on that. So when you think about your community, is there some stories or voices in your community that maybe those stories are not told and that you would like for them to be told? And then how can you work so that improvements are and preservation is to the benefit of an existing community, the people who are already there. So you're not necessarily doing improvements and preserving people so that folks move in and experience the community. You're doing it for the benefit of those who are already there. I'm just gonna look at the chat real quick. Good, we're getting some good stuff here. Excellent, thank you. So storytelling, I think, is a powerful way to build those connections, build empathy, and to tell some of the stories that um, maybe have been forgotten in your community. So people can connect on a personal level when they hear someone's story, regardless of background. That's part of the strength of storytelling. And here's some examples I shared on the slide here of how storytelling can be used in advocacy and community engagement. Creating a video or podcast series. Those are great ways to do it. Hosting a storytelling event where community members can share their own stories. Creating a walking tour. That's a great one that highlights the history of a community through storytelling. We just worked with Cedar Key to update their historic preservation walking tour, and that has been a great tool for them to be able to share their history and their stories. And then developing a website, social media campaign that shares the stories of historic places. really utilizing, to Mike's point, some of the technology opportunities to be able to share these stories and engage with different audiences. And this quote here is when we were working on our Florida's Historic Preservation Toolkit project, we did a lot of listening in communities around the state. And this was one of the folks' quote about what historic preservation meant to them. And I thought it was really, really interesting and cool. So I like to include that. For those of you who can't see the slide, it says, "My ancestors, how did they get here? What was life like for them? And what are we going to do about it?" Which I thought is a pretty cool definition of historic preservation. And
Melissa, can I add something while you're
oh
talking
yeah,
about
please do.
storytelling?
Yeah, when we go back.
Yeah, it just came to mind as you were talking about this. We had a great opportunity to use storytelling to save a historic structure um, at POMS. We did a event at Peck High School, which is a local school that is used by the community now as a community center and a resource for lots of different things. But they're trying to submit a National Register application for it. And there just wasn't a lot of information about the impact of the school on the community. So we worked with Mia Sadler, who's a great preservationist there in the area, and she in Fernandina Beach, and she was able to get alumni from the school who attended historically to come to the school and share their stories of the impact of the school, what the importance was to the community. And I think that those stories are going to be key in putting together the context of why Peck High School is important to the community, why it deserves to be recognized on the National Register. So I just thought it was a good example of a way that kind of oral history and storytelling can be the missing piece when you're talking about why a historic place is important to a community.
That's a great point. And also, it's a good example of technology because we had a really great preservation photographer, Mark Crancer, who came for our Giving Back event. And he had a drone that he was able to get up into the sky and take aerial photos of the school. And I think that will really enhance the application for the National Register for the school because they have the historic school and then there was an addition. And so when you're looking at it from the top, you can clearly see delineated, well, here's the historic part of the school and here's like the addition back here. And that's what that looks like. So yeah, that is a great example. Thanks, Mike. So as we were talking about our preservation toolkits, just wanted to share for our storytelling and way of connecting more broadly that language can be a barrier to preservation. I mentioned this when I was talking to the class yesterday. Sometimes when we get really on a roll as preservationists, we can throw a lot of acronyms out there or talk about things that maybe folks maybe who are newer to the movement aren't necessarily familiar with. So I wanted to share some resources that could help you in your messaging to different stakeholder groups, from lawmakers to community members. We are very excited and proud of our Florida's Historic Preservation Toolkit that's available for free on our website. And there's a whole section on there on advocacy. But there's different sections in there, and you could find whatever you're looking for about historic preservation in there. But we really worked so that our language was easy to digest and easy for anyone on their preservation journey to kind of get started. It wasn't reading like a textbook. You kind of just get in, get out. You need to know what you need to know, and then you move on. The National Alliance of Preservation Commissions also has a messaging guide for local preservation programs. So their audience, generally is those preservation commissions, but a lot of information on that messaging guide is very helpful just for communicating in general about historic preservation. And they say a lot of the same things that we do about the simplicity of language, making sure you avoid jargon whenever possible, avoid acronyms, all those kind of things. So great reminders from both of those organizations. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the important things that we're trying to do is making sure that people can see themselves in preservation. This is a photo from Bull Bay in Charlotte County, Florida, where I grew up. When Hurricane Ian happened and we did our hurricane assessments, this was one of the counties that was really heavily hit. So it was one of the areas where we wanted to go out and do assessments. Most of the people we talked to, we had to go by boat to get there because this space is really indicative of Florida's maritime history and our working waterfronts and our aquaculture and how that was so vital to our state for so many years. And most of the people in Port Charlotte and Punta Gorda thought that these were long gone, and it's kind of out of the way, so people didn't know if they were still there or not. But we managed to finagle our way onto a boat and get out there and see that they were in fact still there. They had made it through the storm, which was nice. But this was just kind of one piece of Florida's history that kind of sometimes can get lost. Cedar Key, which is on our 11 most endangered list for this year and is on the National Trust 11 most, well, it's our 11 to save, the National Trust 11 most endangered, is indicative of that same kind of losing some cultural heritage pieces of Florida in our working waterfronts and our maritime history. So these are kind of parts of the story that we are working to share. A lot of people think that Florida doesn't, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but they think that Florida doesn't have history. History is where the places where people come from originally, like maybe, up in Massachusetts or New England, and then they come down here to retire and they're like, oh yeah, we love history. And history's in Massachusetts. It's not here. And so a lot of what we do is trying to make sure that we do know that there is history in the state of Florida, and that everyone can see themselves in those stories and the places that we're working to protect. I talked a little bit already about our preservation advocacy work, but that is another important emerging trend, I think, for preservation nonprofits especially, is to make sure that we are effectively and actively advocating for historic preservation at the local, state, and federal level. I know that we don't have to go into the challenges that we faced in this arena over the last year, but this is an important role that preservation nonprofits in particular need to play to protect preservation. Mike, is there anything that you would add to that?
No, I think that was well said. Sorry, I'm also monitoring the chat as we go
I
here.
know
There's a lot
it's,
of great
yeah.
questions coming up.
Well, perfect. And we can talk more about advocacy at the end. I know it can kind of sometimes be overwhelming, so I don't want to spend too long here, but that is, I think, the importance of advocacy for nonprofits in particular, I think, is a growing area of impact for us. Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on some concrete ways that we're seeing folks use kind of new tools or, in some cases, old tools used in new ways in the historic preservation field. And I think the first that we see all the time is people using apps, websites, internet archives as tools. I'm sure you can think of many ways that places do this. I wanted to put in a plug for the Florida Memory Project. Anyone used the Florida Memory Project? I use it weekly for research into historic places around the state. It's incredible to have a central archive that's at the state level to be able to use for researching historic structures or historic neighborhoods. And there's hundreds of examples of those around the world. Another example is people using Wikipedia, things like that, to share information. And Wikipedia may seem like kind of a basic way to share information about historic places, but I worked with a nonprofit called Art and Feminism recently, and one of their main drives is to get people onto Wikipedia and add information about female artists, which sounds very simple. Well, when you consider that most of the editors of Wikipedia are male and most of the artists that are represented there are male, it gives you an example of why it's important to just get information about things that might not be generally on the internet there. So that'd be a great way to add to the field of historic preservation. If anyone is interested in a Wikipedia edit-a-thon, a wiki-a-thon, they call them, to add information about historic sites in Florida. It's a great way to get information out there. Um, Also, we've got someone just mentioned this cool image here. We've got lots of ways to use things like augmented reality in the field of historic preservation. I've seen people use it in very simple ways. In fact, you might think you're looking at a computer screen in this picture here, if you're looking at the slide. If you're not looking, I'll describe it for you. It's kind of a ruin of a stone structure, an arch, and then you've got a sketch showing what the rest of the structure would have looked like. It's no longer present. It was destroyed or crumbled years ago. Well, this is actually just a sign. This is a very, very simple, low tech way to use what you might consider augmented reality today. But this simple sign, which just shows the missing portion of this historic structure and kind of re explains its context or importance to people, you can also do the same thing with augmented reality. You have apps where you can use your phone and walk around a historic site looking at your phone to see what the missing pieces would look like. In fact, the local museum did that here in Fort Myers to show what a historic fort that's no longer present would have looked like. You can just walk around either with a virtual reality headset that they have in their museum or with a phone to see the fort, a model of what the fort would have looked like. But you've also got all kinds of map and location mapping technology that is getting easier and easier to use. You've probably heard of things like GIS or global mapping. You can use that to create highly location specific data In our site, we've experimented with using that. We're a 20-acre outdoor site with over a dozen historic structures. Using that so you can have an app where it will prompt people to say, hey, there was once a historic barn at the location that you're standing on, et cetera. Material technology, incredibly important. We've used 3D printing on our site as a tool to produce some difficult historic preservation materials. That's something that I see more and more. In the sustainability field, we had several people mention sea level rise and flooding. There's new materials that can shed water around foundations or applications you can do to stone or brick materials to make them more water resistant. All kinds of polymers, resins that we could talk about here. This is not my area of expertise or Melissa's either. We're not building scientists, but I had to mention it because it's a key area that's going to impact historic preservation in the next decade. And then I think it's kind of paradoxical, but I had to mention that traditional craftsmanship, people that are doing preservation crafts, woodworkers, fine carpenters, brick masons, those are incredibly important and becoming incredibly hard to find in many places. So while you may not think about this as being part of the future of historic preservation, it absolutely is. We need people in the trades that are experts in their fields. And I can say, as someone that manages a historic site from day to day, is incredibly important to find, incredibly difficult and important to find skilled craftspeople. We've got tools to document or assess sites. Melissa mentioned drone photography that was used recently. We've used that at our site as well, and I can tell you it's really a great tool to document or to assess. Like if you want to look at a chimney on the second floor of a building that's very difficult to access from the roof, a drone is an incredible tool to have. Also 3D and laser scanning you see people using to document maybe a building that they know is going to be lost or a building that they're going to begin a major restoration project on. You can get a scan that shows you down, below the centimeter to the millimeter, exactly what the size and dimensions of the historic site are. I'll wrap this up quickly because we could go on for a long time here. But ground penetrating radar, you might be familiar, often used in archaeological sites. You see it being used all the time. Infrared thermography, all kinds of things that you can use to assess something like moisture inside a historic structure to look at if there are issues with mold, what the inside of a wall looks like before you open it up, all kinds of great new tools. And the last thing I wanted to mention on this topic is the new methods that are available to interpret historic sites. Um, I think it's really interesting when you look at ways to interpret a historic place that meet people where they are. So you see things like haunted history tours. Again, this may seem very basic, but I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle if you want to engage your community in historic preservation. Public history, thinking about leveraging the backgrounds of your historic places that are unique to your community. My absolute favorite tour I've ever taken at a historic place or a museum is the Tenement Museum in New York City. I'm sure some people have been there. It's a museum that was specifically designed to highlight the immigrant experience, and it's in a historic tenement, a historic apartment building in New York. So they had this historic place, and it's being utilized to tell the story that only it can tell. I mean, I think that's a great use of a historic place and a great way to use storytelling as a way to engage people in that historic place.
Yeah, that's a great example, Mike. And then as you were going through these, I kind of was thinking of Railroad Square here in Tallahassee was on our 11 to save list, I believe last year. It was hit by a tornado. It was really devastating. It's sort of an arts and cultural space here in Tallahassee. And the students of the Florida State University Historic Preservation class got together and did a story map of that space, which is another great tool and sort of kind of combining community outreach and storytelling and new technologies. But it was a great tool to kind of capture that space and what it was for the community. And in particular, I think for spaces that in fact might be lost, like the future of Railroad Square is not certain. So
Mhm.
I think sometimes what we think about with historic preservation is how to uh, capture where we are right now. Like Egmont Key, another one of our 11 to save sites from 2017, it's a barrier island. And as we acknowledge the changing environment around us, it's very likely that it will be gone relatively soon. So how do we think through capturing places that we know are going to be lost and capturing those stories and those memories? I think that's a pretty big challenge, but something that we have to think about. I know that NAPC, when they go do resiliency training, one of the things that they're teaching commissions is how are your community values going to be represented in the place where your limited resources are directed? So in St. Augustine, we're going to do our community values survey, and it's going to maybe rank very high the Castillo, but there may not be dollars to save everything. Is some of the sad reality that I think is also an emerging trend in historic preservation. But I don't want to end on a down note. I should have said that at the beginning, and we should have ended with your very positive museum story. So that's on me. Um,
That's all right. I'm sure we're going to have some questions that will be positive and
Yes, please. Let's just somebody say something positive. I feel guilty. So just as an overview, we had a very brief period of time, and Mike and I were burned at Palms by going too long. So we wanted to make sure that we left time for questions. But I also did want to say that we're kind of taking what y'all say and incorporating it into the programs and the content and the focus of the Florida Trust moving forward, because we want to hear from you and your communities what you guys are facing and what you think is important for the preservation movement. So at this point, if you want to unmute and just ask a question, we can look at the chat and answer some questions there. You can raise your hand if you'd like to, but yeah, let us know what your questions and thoughts are.
I can start. I did see a question in the chat that I can read out and maybe we can toss around here. Stella Kearns asked suggestions for private sector consultants and ways to build trust and connection with communities when distance and budget constraints limit
Mm.
in-person interactions. What are your thoughts on that, Melissa?
Um, and Stella, you're welcome to tell us some more context if you'd like to, but I think in that situation, one of the best things you might be able to do is focus on that collaboration building and maybe connect with organizations that are there locally already. Like, for instance, in Cedar Key, when we were working on our community outreach there, we definitely focused on working with the mayor's office, the city council, because I can't be in Cedar Key every day, although I would really love to be in Cedar Key every day. And then the Cedar Key Historical Museum and Historic Preservation Association, they were there in the community. They had the trust of everyone there already. So if we weren't able to be there or ask a question, they were able to be that community liaison for us. So maybe hopefully that would help a little bit. I don't know, Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I would love to hear more about the question, but the first thing that came to mind for me was building connections with smaller local groups that are really connected to what the community is interested in and what their needs are. Like we have a local Southwest Florida Historical Society, we have a Black History Association here. We have even ancestry and genealogy groups that are connected
Hmm.
to the history of the area. Anyone that's collecting oral histories, things like that, historical associations, all those things, I think are the people that you should be connected with.
Hi. So, a little bit
Thank you.
more about my question. Thank you so much for your suggestions. Those are definitely things that um, are feasible to do and ways to start the conversations. So, my question originates from my capstone project that I did, not necessarily things I've done in my professional career, but
Mhm.
just going into a community as an outsider and trying to um, embed yourself a little bit more, but not having the ability to necessarily be in person to or be there every day to have those conversations and build those connections that sometimes might be long term or create the environment that allows community members to believe in and kind of buy into the preservation aspect of community building.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it is, it's definitely a challenge. I definitely hear what you're saying there. In addition, as you were talking, I thought, in addition to connecting with some of the local folks there and building relationships with those organizations, and don't forget, excuse me, depending on the scope of your project, our Main Street organizations are really, really great
Yeah.
resources to have. Your local preservation commission, your planning department, all of those folks are great to have, and they want to help. I mean, 9 times out of nine, they're going to be so excited to have somebody who is helping with that preservation project. Um, But in addition to that, like Mike was saying, sometimes, we have this great technology now. We have this great resource that can be kind of a leveling influence. So even if you cannot be there in person, maybe there is some opportunities because of technology that you might be able to still work on building those relationships. So maybe Zoom calls or other social media, creating things like that. You may be able to build connections in that way. But those are great questions. Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, it ties perfectly into something Eric Martin said earlier, that there's sometimes groups that if you don't live locally, they seem to mistrust you. And I think that's 100%
Mhm.
right. I
Mhm.
mean, and especially if you think about historic preservation as a field, some people do think about it still as a top-down profession. Like there's planners and architects that are thinking about what should be saved, what's important. So that's why I think one of the things that's important for the future of the field is to emphasize that this can be a totally community-led process. Community members can be setting priorities. Not that there aren't preservation planners and architects who some of them are on the call today. Thank you for being here, that are a key part of this whole process. But I think emphasizing the community-led aspects of how this can work is an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Stella. That was a great question.
Mike, I see a question from Joe here that I'm going to ask you. Where do you think the biggest need for representation and or recognition is in the state right now?
Ooh, okay. So I would ask Joe, are you asking this question like geographically, or are you asking this question the area or the topic that needs the most representation or
Oh,
recognition? Or maybe you know the answer to that, Melissa. How do you interpret that?
the topic. He just
The
told me.
topic, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Great. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. That's a great question. I mean, we already talked about the need for community-led efforts in the field. I think that's really important. To me, I think the things that would make the biggest difference in the field are advocacy based, like if we were able to get a state historic tax credit, if we're able to move conversations just of everyday people, of lawmakers, of citizens around the state to be thinking more about historic preservation. I think that is the most important thing that we could do right now. So try to talk to everyday people and lawmakers about how important preservation is to you as a preservationist, as a member of your community.
Yeah.
What
And
do you
Mike,
think, Melissa?
yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I think, Joe, what you're asking is a great opportunity to just remind everyone that one thing that we can all for sure do is be active in our communities and to be supportive of preservation in our communities and to be a part of preservation in our communities because we all have regionally and different challenges that we need to work with and different players, different audiences, different stakeholders. So I think for us being aware of what those challenges are in our own community is a great way to kind of start at the micro level. And to put in just a little bit of a pitch for the Florida Trust, our regional councils, that's a big part of what we're trying to do is to sort of to protect and promote preservation at the local level with a regional kind of lens. So, for instance, Mike, you're in Fort Myers. I know that you guys do in your region sort of happy hours where you meet with
Mhm.
FPAN and you talk with issues there. You do walking tours of historic sites in your area. But there's also like emails that we get that are like, hey guys, we've got this particular issue that's happening. Maybe it's a zoning issue around a cemetery. Can we all get on the same page and talk to the commission about this issue with this historic cemetery is really important. So I think being active locally is a really key thing. But also at a macro level, like Mike was saying, we have legislative session that is starting in January coming up next year. And there are some big things that we are going to want to work together on a macro level on. Last year, 0 grants got funded through the Division of Historical Resources, historic preservation grants. There were a few projects that were kind of selected to get some funds, but it completely sidestepped the process of the Historical Commission and how they rank the applicants and the Secretary of State's approval and all of those things. And we are really focusing on strengthening the legislature's understanding of how the process works, why it's valid. And of course, please to the legislature, please fund these programs. As I've mentioned already, it is the largest investment in historic preservation, bricks and mortar preservation that happens in the state and from the state. And it's really important that these things happen because chances are in your community, there is a project that would be benefited by grant funding if they are passed. So just kind of keep an eye out for, you can follow us on social, you can be on our website, however you want to stay connected. But when the legislative session starts, we will absolutely be every week doing newsletters that say, here's what's happened during session. And you will have opportunities to talk to your lawmakers, to advocate for funding for those grants. We also, as has been mentioned a few times, have worked in years past and will continue to work on establishing a statewide historic preservation tax credit for Florida. That is something that would be a really important incentive to help make the numbers work for historic preservation projects throughout the state. So we will continue to work on that. And then finally, the third thing that just keep an eye on for the advocacy work in the session timeframe is there are going to be bills that we are going to respond to. So there are going to be bills that are either going to be troubling for historic preservation or that could potentially benefit historic preservation. And we will share our concerns or support with you and then ask for you to support or to share your concerns on those as well. So I guess that's in conclusion, at the micro level, be involved in preservation in your community, and at the macro level, please try to stay aware of state and national preservation initiatives. Mike, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that was very well said.
Okay.
We just have one more question, but I don't know if we have enough time to address one more. What do you think, Melissa?
Yeah, let's go crazy.
All right. I'm going to try and summarize because it's a longer one. Joel A asked, are there examples of a city you know of that has great historic design guidelines that you think is clear and easy for residents and groups to access and review? And then a really good example of Franklin, Tennessee, where he feels like that is the case. Material requirements, review process can be difficult for some people, though, and has raised concerns. What do you think, Melissa? Let's just take the first part of the question. Is there a city that you think is a good, shining example?
Yeah, and this is Franklin, Tennessee, right south of Nashville, right? I can't imagine I mean, maybe there's more than one Franklin, Tennessee. I don't know. But that
Yeah, it is. We're here in Franklin, Tennessee, south of Nashville. Yes.
Okay, so this is a great example for many communities in Florida as well, because they have really had, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joel, but from my understanding, there has been a lot of development pressures, probably maybe some changing in the community as the economics of the community shift. So this would be something that we would for sure see in Florida as well.
Mhm.
Yes. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to change the page there. So the first part of the question is, do we know cities that have great guidelines? I do think that San Antonio, Texas does a great job with their guidelines. And then I would also say, if you want to go check out the NAPC page, they also have a lot of great design guidelines that they've kind of through the nation compiled together. And they also have a great listserv, so you can kind of talk directly to that audience and get some examples there as well. Mike, what would you add anything to that?
No, I don't know the actual guidelines in Fernandina Beach where the POMS conference was, but I noted and I heard several other people say how impressed they were with the integrity of their historic downtown business district. There's not a lot of infill, not a lot of non-historic structures. A lot of historic things have been well preserved. And when, modern infill was done, it was done well. It seemed to be really in compliance with their standards. So that's one place I've walked through physically and not actually examined their guidelines, but been impressed with the integrity of.
Yeah, and I think on the flip side of that, I was at the National Trust Conference last week, and we did a session with the Los Angeles Conservancy on resiliency and preservation. And one of the participants in the session mentioned that after a disaster, that their commission became more lenient with some of their design guidelines because of the financial difficulties that so many in the community were facing as a result of these disasters. And it kind of got me thinking, if we can be lenient in some, I don't want to open a can of worms, but maybe as we think through the ways that our communities are changing and the increasing risk of very strong weather events, maybe we need to think through those sort of topics on the front end with some of our design guidelines. But here in Tallahassee, it has been a difficult challenge for sure.
I'll just throw out a couple people in the chat to end this on a really positive note.
Yes, please do.
Have
Thank
mentioned
you.
towns in Florida that they think are doing a great job. Town of Palm Beach has historic preservation program, dates back to 1979, which is around when a lot of historic preservation programs were put into place at that centennial. But that's been very effective. New Orleans was mentioned, but back in Florida, we had two people mention Miami Beach and one Coral Gables. So East Coast of Florida getting a lot of love there.
Wonderful. So I wanted to share this resources page real quick. These are some of the URLs to some of the resources we mentioned during our conversation. For everyone who registered for the call, you will get a email follow-up that will have the presentation, so you don't have to worry about like writing these down real quick. You'll get the presentation, and then you'll also get a link to the YouTube video of today's session. But I did want to share these resources, and then also I was going to share my contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to give me an email or call us here at the Florida Trust House. I wanted to thank again our sponsors, the Graciano Corporation, for making this conversation possible today. And then in our follow-up email, we will also talk a little bit about our October Lunch and Learns that are coming up. We have a really great one about CRAs that's going to happen in October, and then also a really great lunch and learn about cemetery preservation and resources to do that work in your community. So those are two lunch and learns that we have coming up next month, and all of that will be in your follow-up email. But I did want to say just thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you. Mike, did you want to say anything else?
No, I wanted to say thank you so much for all the engagement. You guys really made
Yeah.
this very enjoyable. Great conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.